According to Chuck Swindoll, the entire Bible on average mentions the return of Christ or the end times 1 out of every 30 verses. That's amazing. In just the New Testament alone, 23 out of the 27 books all mention the return of Christ. And these 23 books contain over 300 references to Christ's return. Of course, the book of Matthew has to be one of them, right? Matthew mentions Christ's return and the kingdom he will establish more than any other book. But it's hard to imagine without remembering the overall Jewishness of Matthew's entire book. Remember, Matthew's presenting the king to the nation that rejected him. He's describing what happened then, and consequently, what is happening now, and what will happen in the future. While Matthew mentions some things that are specific to believers of this age, in fact, he's the only gospel writer to even mention a special group of people called the church, his primary audience is Israel, not the church. He's explaining why that long-promised earthly kingdom the Jews were anticipating has now been temporarily postponed. In the Olivet Discourse, chapters 24 and 25, he describes the establishment of that postponed kingdom. In our 6th video, Jesus described the mystery form of the kingdom in 7 parables. In this video, Jesus describes the end of the age, the return of the king, and the beginning of Christ's earthly reign. That's been Matthew's main point all along. He structured his story in such a way as to drive home that point. We already know from the other gospel accounts, Matthew rearranged his chronology to make the 7 parables of the kingdom the centerpiece of his entire book. And these parables, along with the Olivet Discourse we're looking at in this video, follow the rejection of Messiah's identity in chapters 1 through 4, the rejection of Messiah's kingdom principles in chapters 5 through 7, and the rejection of Messiah's credentials, proving he really was who he claimed to be in chapter 8 and onward. Remember, in chapter 8, Jesus marveled that he hadn't seen so much faith in all Israel as demonstrated by that one Gentile centurion. In chapter 11, he said the Gentile cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Sodom would be better off on the day of judgment than those Israelite cities who had actually witnessed his miracles and still rejected him. The Gentiles would have repented, but Israel didn't. Matthew emphasizes this stark contrast between believing Gentiles and unbelieving Jews. And in fact, he includes Jesus specifically stating in Matthew 11:22 through 24 that the sons of the kingdom, meaning Israel, would be thrown into outer darkness, where there would be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Israel's rejection doesn't culminate until chapter 27, but at this point in the story, that crucifixion isn't very far off. Opposition has been mounting since chapter 8. When Jesus sent out his disciples in chapter 10 to only the house of Israel, he warned them they would face persecution. By chapter 12, the Pharisees were blaspheming the Holy Spirit and plotting how they could murder Jesus. And that kingdom, which had been presented as being at hand from the time of John the Baptist through chapter 10, doesn't seem so at hand anymore. From chapter 10, onward through the end of the book, no one says that the kingdom is at hand. In chapter 13, Jesus abruptly switches his teaching style. Rather than speaking plainly to the people, he begins cloaking his truth in parables to deliberately hide the meaning from Israel. They've already rejected the truth he's given them, so in chapter 13, he begins speaking about a mystery form of the kingdom, a kingdom of good seed and bad seed, marked by huge external growth but internal corruption. He doesn't interpret most of the parables to the general public, but he does explain some privately to his disciples as he begins preparing them for his coming death, resurrection, and the temporary postponement of that earthly kingdom they all thought they were just getting ready to start. More and more frequently, Jesus clashes with the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Herodians until in chapter 23, Jesus confronts them in Jerusalem, in the Jewish temple, pronouncing 7 woes against these religious leaders of Israel.
Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples,
"The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts, and the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves, nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done, without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, "If we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets." You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of innocent Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'"
And with that, Jesus left the temple for the last time. The Olivet Discourse follows this scathing castigation of Israel's religious leaders. Jesus extrapolates their unbelief to Jerusalem as a whole, and by inference, to the entire nation of Israel. That all this occurred in the Jewish temple, the one place on earth where man and God are supposed to be able to resolve their differences, is both ironic and tragic. Jesus had just told Israel that they'd kissed away the kingdom they'd all been waiting for thousands of years. But the entire encounter goes over the heads of his disciples. When you read the next verse, you get the impression these guys just stepped off the tour bus and were busy sightseeing somewhere while Jesus was having that big altercation back in chapter 23. Now, in all fairness, we might not have done any better. The Jewish temple really was the most magnificent man-made structure in all of Israel. Well, certainly the most magnificent these fishermen had ever seen. But, get real, guys. This isn't your first trip to the big city. Jesus just seems to cut them short, saying,
"You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down."
Well, that shut them up for a while. They quietly descend the Temple Mount, they cross the Kedron Valley, and then begin ascending the Mount of Olives on their way back to Bethany, where they're spending the night. Finally, they just can't stand it any longer. They must have stopped to rest or something going up the hill. And then in response to Jesus' declaration about the destruction of the temple, about him going away, they work up their nerve to ask Jesus 3 questions.
As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying,
"Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age?"
Keep in mind that these guys had forsaken everything to follow Jesus around the countryside for the last 3 years or so. Back at the temple, they just heard Jesus say he was going away, so he won't be around much longer to set up that kingdom after all. Then Jesus said the Jewish temple would be destroyed. Destroyed? The temple that Herod was taking nearly 40 years to complete and still wasn't done. Well, sure, they had a few questions, all right. The last time the temple was destroyed was in 586 BC. The Babylonians swept across Israel, wiping out everything in their path. They totally destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and countless thousands of Jews were slaughtered outright. Thousands more died on a long forced march back to Babylon, and those few that did survive all faced 70 years of captivity, most dying without ever seeing Jerusalem again. That destruction signaled the end of the Jewish monarchy. The Jewish temple was not only the religious and cultural center of Israel, it was Israel's national identity. It represented that special covenant relationship they had with Yahweh, and nobody else did. At the time, it was the only legitimate place on earth to make sacrifices to Yahweh. If the temple was going to be destroyed again, what will happen to Israel this time? If Jesus is going away, what will happen to the promised kingdom we all thought we were initiating? And if we're not initiating a new kingdom, what's going to happen to us? If you misunderstand where these guys are coming from, you're going to miss the answer too. They have no conception of some mystical body of believers comprised of both Jews and Gentiles together equally, spanning time and space, as being the very body of Messiah on earth, indwelled and empowered by the Holy Spirit. They were still expecting Jesus to establish that promised earthly kingdom, and pretty darn soon too, in Jerusalem, with them somewhere near the top. Their questions don't have anything to do with the church. The focus of their questions and Jesus' response centers on what's going to happen to Israel, what's going to happen to the Jewish temple, when will Jesus finally establish that kingdom in Jerusalem and usher in a new age. Matthew doesn't record the answer to the first question at all. Luke, who you'll remember is writing to Gentiles, seems to provide the answer in Luke chapter 21.
When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. For there will be great distress upon the earth, and wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led captive among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
Matthew's primary audience doesn't care about that. So he skips over that times of the Gentiles stuff completely and focuses on the events leading up to Messiah's return and the establishment of that promised kingdom. In answer to the second question, Jesus provides general signs to look for in verses 24:4 through 14.
And Jesus answered them,
See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation, and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away, and betray one another, and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise, and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come.
And then the end will come. Jesus first warns Israel not to be deceived. False messiahs will come. There will be increasing wars, famines, and death from pestilence and natural disasters, but this is just the beginning of birth pains. Messiah followers will be hated and martyred. They'll be betrayed by friends and family alike. And if all of this sounds familiar, Jesus said the similar thing in chapter 10 when he sent his disciples out proclaiming to Israel that the kingdom was at hand. Now the kingdom is at hand again, and the disciples living during this time period will face more of the same. As bad as those first four calamities sound, they're mild by comparison to what follows. Now, Jesus is not talking about today. He's not talking about the church. He's not even talking about Gentiles. Yes, we have wars, we have famine, we have death, and it seems like we've had them all forever. We've even got, well, we had Reverend Moon claiming to be the Christ. That didn't last that long, did it? But this isn't about us. We are living in the times of the Gentiles, and very few Jews are going to fall for some rich Korean businessman as being the Messiah. Jesus is describing a future period of time called the time of Jacob's trouble. Particularly notice verse 24:13. The one who endures to the end will be saved. This is not talking about going to heaven when you die. The wording here is conditional. It depends upon human accomplishment. The humans have to endure all of the horrible calamities Jesus just described. A period so terrible that Jewish prophets called it the time of Jacob's trouble.
These are the words that the Lord spoke concerning Israel and Judah. Thus says the Lord,
We have heard a cry of panic, of terror, and no peace. Ask now and see, can a man bear a child? Why then do I see every man with his hands on his stomach like a woman in labor? Why has every face turned pale? Alas, that day is so great, there is none like it. It is a time of distress for Jacob, yet he shall be saved out of it.
Much of what the Jewish prophets wrote had both a near and far application. The immediate context here was the Babylonians coming in to destroy the temple, Jerusalem, and the entire southern kingdom of Judah. They slaughtered a lot of people and hauled off the survivors. But as you read the text closer, some things just don't fit that historical context. Verses 18 through 20 appear to speak of Israel being restored and Jerusalem being rebuilt, but nothing historical fits verses 21 through 24.
Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will restore the fortunes of the tents of Jacob, and have compassion on his dwellings. The city shall be rebuilt on its mound, and the palace shall stand where it used to be. Out of them shall come songs of thanksgiving, and the voices of those who celebrate. I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will make them honored, and they shall not be small. Their children shall be as they were of old, and their congregation shall be established before me, and I will punish all who oppress them. Their prince shall be one of themselves. Their ruler shall come out from their midst. I will make him draw near, and he shall approach me. For who would dare of himself to approach me, declares the Lord.
And you shall be my people, and I will be your God.
The prince in verse 21 has to be Messiah, and that just hasn't happened yet. You shall be my people, and I will be your God also hasn't literally happened to Israel yet.
Behold, the storm of the Lord. Wrath has gone forth, a whirling tempest. It will burst upon the head of the wicked. The fierce anger of the Lord will not turn back until he has executed and accomplished the intentions of his mind. In the latter days, you will understand this.
Those who somehow survive or endure this time of Jacob's trouble may be able to enter the prince's righteous kingdom. How they enter the kingdom is the subject of the rest of Jesus' message. As Jesus hinted when he gave those general signs saying that the first 4 were just the beginning of birth pains, the time of Jacob's trouble seems to be divided into 2 parts, with the latter half being so horrendous that Jesus provides Israel with one specific sign to watch for that no one can mistake.
So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the listener understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So, if they say to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. If they say, "Look, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man.
Where the NIV translates great distress, and the King James Version and the English Standard Version we're listening to uses the phrase great tribulation. Now that's where we get the terms great tribulation and tribulation period to describe this time of unprecedented calamity and devastation, unlike anything that's ever happened before or will ever happen again. When Jesus says those days had been cut short, past tense, he doesn't mean that there was originally some set period of time that God decided later on to shorten a little bit. The emphasis here is on the severity of the time of Jacob's trouble. Most people living during that period are going to die. And if it were any longer, everyone would die. Jesus again stresses awareness of false messiahs. He mentions them in verse 5 and again in verse 23 through 27, warning Israel to beware of people showing up claiming to be him. Now it's interesting that false messiahs are distinguished from false prophets. So the prophets will fool many people into accepting these false messiahs, but it's reassuring to know that the elect, the chosen ones, will not be fooled by these guys. Jesus included the phrase, "if possible," clearly indicating that it isn't possible. Jesus sets the exact time for the beginning of this great tribulation at the midpoint of the final 7 years of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. So, who's Daniel, and what's this prophecy all about anyway? After the time of King Solomon, Israel was divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was destroyed in 722 BC, but the southern kingdom hung on until 586, when the Babylonians swept in and destroyed the kingdom and the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Daniel was hauled away to Babylon along with the rest of the survivors, and years later he was studying his Jewish scriptures. He determined from reading the scroll of Jeremiah that Israel's captivity in Babylon was to last only 70 years. Realizing that time was almost up, Daniel began praying and interceding with Yahweh on behalf of his fellow Jews.
O Lord, according to all your righteous acts, let your anger and your wrath turn away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy hill. Because for our sins and for the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and your people have become a byword among all who are around us. Now therefore, O our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his pleas for mercy, and for your own sake, O Lord, make your face to shine upon your sanctuary, which is desolate. O my God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations, and the city that is called by your name. For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not for your own sake, O my God, because your city and your people are called by your name.
Daniel was pleading for his nation, his capital city, his people, Israel. Notice all the specific references to Jerusalem, your city, your holy city, your holy hill, Zion, the sanctuary, your people. Daniel was praying for God's undeserved mercy on the Jewish nation, Jerusalem, and the Jewish temple. In response to Daniel's prayer, an angel shows up to deliver God's response relating to Israel and Jerusalem. 77s are decreed for Israel and Jerusalem to accomplish 6 specific things. But after the first 69 weeks,
and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator.
Most interpreters agree that the 7s are weeks of years, but beyond that there is considerable disagreement as to what the rest of this prophecy really means. The first 69 weeks pretty obviously ended with Messiah when he presented himself to Jerusalem as king on what Christians called Palm Sunday. Remember, he rode into Jerusalem and they said, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." But between the 69th and 70th week, Messiah is killed and the Romans destroy the city and the temple. The question is, who is it that makes the covenant with the many for 1 week and then causes the desolation when he breaks that covenant 3.5 years later? Now, some people see historical fulfillment in Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC. Others believe it might be General Titus when he was destroying the city in 70 AD. But neither of these guys made a 7-year covenant with Israel. And neither of these guys actually fit the literal context of Jesus' warning, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. I mean, Antiochus had already come and gone before Jesus said this, so he's automatically disqualified. And neither he nor Titus meet this criteria, nor ever shall be. If you accept Jesus' words at face value, Adolf Hitler obviously exceeded both Antiochus and Titus in horror, carnage, and sheer numbers. He didn't just destroy one city, he attempted to exterminate the entire Jewish race. So that's why futurists look forward to a future ruler only typified by these guys who will make that covenant with Israel and then cause the sacrifices and offerings to cease in the temple 3.5 years later. Now that you've looked at all of the Jewish references in Daniel's prayer and the angel's response, look at the Jewish references in Jesus' discourse. Jesus is speaking specifically to practicing Jews living in Judea at the time this future event takes place. He references Levitical law and Sabbath travel restrictions, which will be in effect when this event occurs. The church is under no such restrictions. We can travel any day of the week. The holy place can be none other than the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. So any straightforward literal interpretation requires a literal temple rebuilt in Jerusalem for a literal people observing the Levitical law and practicing the Jewish sacrificial system at some future date. If accepted at face value, this passage has to negate any argument that there will be no tribulation, or that, well, we've always had tribulation in the world, so this will be just more of the same, maybe more severe. The plain sense of this passage says that there will be a specific period of time so perilous, so devastating, that it will be unprecedented in human history, and if God had not limited its length, no human would survive. That clearly leaves out Titus and 70 AD. The book of Revelation provides a parallel description of this same time period, and the overall picture is quite clear. Simply reading down that list of seals, trumpets, and bowls should convince any literal interpreter that this future Holocaust will destroy well over half the world population in just a few years.
Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
Immediately after the Great Tribulation, the sun, moon, and stars go dark, and all the heavens are in turmoil. I don't know if this means that the sun and stars just suddenly stop shining, or perhaps we just can't see them. Maybe there's so much pollution from the previous 7 years of turmoil that you won't be able to see the sun or the moon or stars. Either way, Messiah suddenly appears in the sky, and everyone will see him. Matthew records Jesus saying later in Matthew 25:31 that he'll appear with all his holy angels. And he has a lot of them. Here, he says the angels will gather all the elect, all the chosen. John in Revelation 19 says that Jesus will be riding a white horse, followed by all the armies of heaven. It sounds like it's going to be a pretty big spectacle, and no one will miss it. Jesus is actually paraphrasing from Isaiah 13, which reads in part,
"Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation, and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light.
I will punish the world for its evil, and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant, and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place."
From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away.
Jesus uses the analogy of the fig tree to emphasize the nearness of his return to those signs he just predicted, and the truthfulness that everything he predicted will come to pass. The English word translated near in verse 33 is the Greek word engus. I think that's right, E-N-G-G-U-S. Exactly the same word that John the Baptist used when he said, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand," or near. It's used 30 times in the King James Version. It's translated nigh, at hand, near, from, nigh unto, and ready. Generation is the Greek word genia, and is variously translated generation, time, age, or nation. Jesus is saying the nearness of his return is so close to these predicted signs that those who witness all the signs and survive will witness his return. It could be a promise that the nation of Israel will not be completely destroyed before he returns, but I think it's more likely a promise that some of those who must endure the tribulation period will still be alive to witness his return.
Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley.
Then he led me to the gate facing east, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the east, and the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and just like the vision that I had seen by the Kibar Canal. And I fell on my face. As the glory of the Lord entered the temple by the gate facing east, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. While the man was standing beside me, I heard one speaking to me out of the temple, and he said to me,
Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever.
Zechariah says that Messiah will touch down on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem. Interestingly, this is exactly where Jesus is at, where he's giving this discourse. And ironically, this will also be the mountain from which he ascends into heaven, according to Acts 1:12. The mountain will split apart. Messiah will enter Jerusalem through the eastern gate to assume his throne in the temple. Now, that gate has actually been sealed shut since 1541, when a Turkish Sultan, Solomon I, controlled Jerusalem. Now, he was aware of this prophecy, and he decided that he would prevent Messiah from reaching the temple by sealing the gate and then planting a cemetery in front of the gate, which you can see in this picture if you look closely, under the assumption that Messiah couldn't go through the cemetery because then he would be ceremonially unclean and couldn't enter the temple. Okay, we'll see how that works out for him. Concerning Messiah's appearing, no one knows. Jesus gives several examples of the suddenness with which all of this will happen. People before the flood, 2 men working in the field, 2 women at the grinding stone, the faithful and the unfaithful servants, all oblivious to what was about to befall them.
But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set over his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, My master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
This isn't the church waiting for the rapture. Remember, Daniel's prophecy doesn't have anything to do with the church. It concerns Israel, the temple, and the Jewish people. Jesus is describing what's going to happen in that last week of that prophecy and immediately afterwards. Matthew is warning the Jews their Messiah will suddenly return and call to account those surviving Jews of that period. Yes, he'll eventually judge everybody else, but Matthew is mostly concerned with Israel, not the church. Look at verses 45 through 51. Now, seriously, does anybody really believe that when Jesus comes, he'll cut you asunder and sentence you to hell if you're not personally ready and waiting? No, not if you're saved by grace through faith, apart from works. Jesus is picturing Israel at the time he returns to begin his earthly reign in Jerusalem. Although Noah had been building his boat for hundreds, well, at least 800 years, people still went about their daily lives totally oblivious to the fate that was hanging over their heads. The examples Jesus provides, 2 men working in the field, 2 women at the grinding stone, represent humans at the end of this period Jesus just previously described, going about their daily routines. Suddenly Messiah appears, some will be taken in judgment, while the remaining ones survive to enter Messiah's earthly kingdom. The following parables expand on the idea of waiting, being prepared, and anticipating Messiah's return. Verses 45 through 51 make a comparison between a servant who is anxiously expecting his master to return at any moment and a servant who believes the master won't be coming back for a long time. The expectation of the master's imminent return spurs the good servant to do what the master expects him to do. However, the bad servant is thinking, he's not coming back anytime soon, and he begins to act wickedly. He begins to, I think it says, beat his fellow servants. He has no fear that his master will suddenly show up and catch him in the act. That phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth, only occurs 7 times in the Bible, and every time Jesus is the one who says it. He first used it in Matthew 8, referring to unbelieving Jews when that Gentile centurion believed who Jesus was, but they didn't. In chapter 13, he used it twice in the parables of the wheat and tares and the separation of the fish in the net. Remember? In both instances, it referred to unsaved, and then next Jesus described the phrase in chapter 22, describing guests who showed up at the wedding feast without wearing their wedding garments, referring specifically to unbelieving Jews. Now here it's the servant who's fooling around thinking he won't get caught when his master returns, or if his master returns. A case could be made that this also represents unbelieving Jews, although the principle could be broadly applied to anyone, and in chapter 25 it'll be the final destination for the servant who doesn't invest his talent wisely, and that's probably also unbelieving Jews. The one time Luke uses this phrase, Luke 13:28, again Jesus speaking, it's again used of unbelieving Jews. It's always used in connection with the rejection and final disposition of the wicked, conscious torment, and most of the time, some would say all the time, it specifically refers to unbelieving Jews.
Then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. For when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, "Here is the bridegroom! Come out to meet him!" Then all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise answered, saying, "Since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves." And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast, and the door was shut.
Chapter 25 begins one of the most misused parables in Scripture. 10 virgins, 5 wise, 5 not. None of them are the bride of Christ because this isn't about the church. Jesus isn't hoping to marry 10 women, but willing to settle for 5. He's not marrying half the church and throwing the other half away. He's not even marrying half the church, and maybe he'll come back later for the rest after they've suffered through the tribulation for not being ready. This has absolutely nothing to do with the church and nothing to do with the rapture. It takes place after the tribulation period when Christ returns to the earth. It isn't even about going to heaven. If watching and waiting, having oil in my trimmed lamp, whatever you might spiritualize that to mean, pressing in, walking in the Spirit, all those Christian phrases. If all of that determines whether I get into heaven or not, then I'm in big trouble because I'm not really saved by grace. That unmerited favor of God. So if the church must stay awake, continually fanning the flames and keeping them burning bright in order to get into heaven, they're not saved by faith. They're saved by their own effort, works. In the Jewish wedding, bridesmaids didn't just stand beside the bride and look pretty. They're responsible for attending to the necessary duties to help make the celebration come off smoothly. The lamps they had to maintain would probably have been oil-drenched rags wrapped around the top of poles, or possibly small clay pots, if they were used outdoors particularly. The pots required that the olive oil be replenished about every 15 minutes, and you can see, obviously, it's a tedious and tiring work to keep all of the lamps burning indefinitely and refilling them every 15 minutes or so. That's the point of the entire story. So, to interpret this parable correctly, you need to recognize 2 contextual clues. The first clue is that this passage begins with the word then, obviously connecting this section to the preceding section. The kingdom of heaven is not like 10 virgins waiting for the bridegroom now. The context is Israel at the end of that great tribulation Jesus just got done describing, when Messiah returns to earth with his bride to begin his marriage feast, that promised literal earthly messianic kingdom. Some Jews will be ready when he returns, others won't. Some will be allowed to enter his kingdom, the others won't. The second clue is that the moral of this parable is exactly the same as all the preceding stories. Matthew 24:44 says, "The Son of Man will come in an hour when you do not expect him." Matthew 24:50 says, "The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of." Matthew 25:13 says, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." Jesus repeats what he means 3 times, so there won't be any doubt. Be ready.
For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them.
This parable is similar to the 10 virgins, but the distribution of talents doesn't emphasize personal readiness, but the servants making good use of what the master has entrusted to them during this seemingly endless wait while the master's gone and everyone's waiting for him to come back for the marriage feast. The first 2 servants invest their talents wisely, double their master's money, and the last servant buries his talent in the ground. When the master returns, he rewards the first 2 by giving them more responsibility and inviting them into the joy of your master. The third servant is punished. His talent is taken from him, and he's cast out into outer darkness.
For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.
By now, Israel would have been waiting for Messiah for at least 4,000 years, and a lot of Jews have pretty much given up on the whole idea. Jews for Jesus conducted a survey in Israel in the 90s. I'm not sure of the exact date, but they found that the majority of Jews that they surveyed are atheists. They don't believe their master is coming back at all. There is no master. So after the Great Tribulation, when their master does finally return, what will he find Israel has been up to in the meantime? That unprofitable servant not only loses what he has, but he's cast out into outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. These are unbelieving Jews, not unproductive church members that just didn't work hard enough. After Messiah has judged Israel, removing all the unrighteous from the survivors of that great tribulation, he turns to what's left of the Gentiles.
When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me."
The word nations in verse 32 is the Greek word ethnos, which is translated 64 times nation. 5 times it's translated heathen, twice people. but 93 times the word is translated Gentiles. It's probably better translated Gentiles in this verse also. God doesn't determine our eternal salvation based upon national affiliation. You don't get to go to heaven because you live in a Christian country, and you don't get a free pass to Christ's earthly kingdom because you're a Jew. He deals with each one of us individually. So I believe he's judging individuals here, not nations corporately. He just finished with all the Jews in the previous parables, and now he's turning to the Gentiles, who will be allowed to enter his earthly kingdom. Notice that those who are not allowed in the kingdom are sent to everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels, but Jesus does not include that phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, I can only assume that he's reserving that for Israel.
Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you?" Then he will answer them, saying, "Truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life.
During the preceding tribulation period, these Gentiles' true faith would have been visibly demonstrated by their conduct towards Jesus's my brothers or my brethren. Jesus is a literal Jew, so Jesus's literal brothers referenced here would logically be the Jews of the recently described tribulation period. It's not that works actually save anybody, only that people's works demonstrate their true faith. Well, just like today. By sheltering and helping the my brethren or my brothers in their greatest hour of need, when the love of the many shall wax cold, and when their own lives might be forfeit for aiding them, they demonstrated their true faith. Now, if this were the same group of people described previously in the other parables, well, Jesus certainly wouldn't require yet another parable to describe the same judging and the same consequences. The idea here is that whereas the 10 virgins and the talents parables demonstrate Messiah removing the unbelieving Jews from the believing Jews, here he's separating unbelieving Gentiles from believing Gentiles. And as in the previous situations, believers' actions proved their true worth, and these believers lived to enter Messiah's earthly kingdom, and all of the unbelievers are physically destroyed to await final judgment and sentencing at the great white throne. Having completed the judging of both the Jews and the Gentiles, Messiah has, in effect, judged the entire surviving human population. All of the unrighteous of that population have been destroyed, and only the righteous human beings still remain to enter the kingdom. They're still in their mortal bodies. Now Messiah can finally consummate the kingdom long promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their physical descendants. Now, during the next 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth, Messiah can fulfill the promises and prophecies made throughout the Old Testament by those Jewish prophets. Now, as the physical descendant of King David, Messiah can assume his rightful throne in Jerusalem and rule the nations with a rod of iron and bring in completion of the 6 specifically stated purposes of the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9.
While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my plea before the Lord my God for the holy hill of my God, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the first, came to me in swift flight at the time of the evening sacrifice. He made me understand, speaking with me and saying,
O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell it to you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place.
I've tried to emphasize throughout this series that Matthew is writing to Jews. He presents evidence proving that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, the King of Israel. He makes more references to Jewish prophecy than any other writer. He emphasizes that promised kingdom more than any other writer. And as you can see from this comparison with the other 2 synoptic gospels, Matthew provides far more detail on Messiah's return to establish that kingdom than any other writer. That kingdom was proclaimed almost from the beginning of the book. John proclaims the kingdom of heaven is at hand in Matthew 3:2. Jesus begins proclaiming the kingdom of heaven is at hand in Matthew 4:17. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus mentions kingdom of heaven 6 times. And in chapter 8, he says that many Gentiles will enter the kingdom of heaven. In chapter 10, his disciples go throughout all of Israel proclaiming the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And in chapter 11, he says the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John the Baptist. The distinctive mark of this kingdom is righteousness. Besides these direct statements, there's a number of parables and illustrations showing the kingdom of heaven. The sheep and the goats, the 10 virgins, the talents distributed to the various servants, the wheat and the tares, the good and the bad fish, and the king inviting his people to his banquet. Matthew's entire book is centered on Messiah's kingdom. Almost immediately, he presents the kingdom principles in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. This first discourse contains themes that are repeated throughout the rest of his book, the most startling being that God is a loving heavenly Father who knows and cares for each individual's needs. The Jews already knew God as a righteous judge, but this was entirely new to them. When Jesus sent his disciples out in chapter 10, they were supposed to go throughout Israel proclaiming the nearness of that kingdom. Kingdom wasn't a new concept to the Jews. They'd been anticipating it since Abraham. Many of the Jewish prophets spoke about it quite a bit. In fact, it's peculiar that from the time of John the Baptist, when he first announced the kingdom of heaven in chapter 3, all the way through the rest of Matthew's book, no one ever asks what kingdom they're talking about. What was new, however, was the rejection and persecution Jesus warned his disciples in this second discourse to expect. So, in anticipation of that final rejection, Jesus describes in his third discourse a mystery form of the kingdom. Now, some of chapter 13 was old truth, but much of it was entirely new. A kingdom made up of both wheat and tares, an invisible righteous kingdom within a corrupt visible kingdom, one valuable treasure purchased and then left in the ground, while another treasure is purchased and immediately possessed. Jesus told his disciples privately about the special called out group he would soon be forming called the church. Well, the fourth discourse continues the theme that was introduced in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus stressed total dependence upon our loving Heavenly Father and service to others in His kingdom. And the final discourse, the Olivet Discourse we've been looking at in this video, described the king's return to Israel to inaugurate that kingdom. All mankind will be judged, every enemy will be destroyed, believing mankind will be ushered into Christ's kingdom on earth, where the lion really will lay down with the lamb. It's just unfortunate that as soon as we hear the word kingdom of heaven, we usually think of up there somewhere. Now, maybe we think of the church universal, but this would not have been the first thought of the Jews upon hearing the proclamation, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. In 2 Samuel 7, God promised David a lineage and a kingdom which would last forever. And this is why Matthew took great pains to demonstrate that Jesus was in David's lineage. The messianic prophecy in Isaiah 9 clearly says that Messiah will reign over Israel on King David's throne. The Lord promises in Zechariah 8 to return to Jerusalem and live there. Old men and old women will sit in safety in the city's streets. Children will play freely. The Lord will bring Jews back from wherever they've been scattered to live in Jerusalem. And, of course, Gentiles will also come to Jerusalem seeking the Lord. From his throne in Jerusalem, Messiah will dispense justice and settle disputes among the people. The law will be administered from Jerusalem, and there will be no more war. Everyone will worship Messiah. If they don't, Messiah will deprive them of rain and plague their countries with the plagues he placed on Egypt. Sounds fair enough. This is the kingdom of heaven those original Jewish listeners were anticipating. Messiah reigning in Jerusalem, all enemies destroyed, citizens living in peace, prosperity, and safety. Messiah himself would enforce justice throughout the world, and this temporal aspect of the kingdom of heaven doesn't have anything to do with going to heaven. That was the furthest thing from these people's minds. It has everything to do with heaven coming to earth. The Olivet Discourse is about heaven coming to earth, the return of the King to finally establish his throne in Jerusalem. There's no specific reference to the church, the body of Christ, anywhere within this section, in parallel gospel passages, or in corresponding passages in Daniel and Revelation. There's also no reference to resurrection, another key event Paul tells us will occur at the same time as the church's rapture. Adding the fact that the church didn't even exist at the time this Olivet Discourse was given, dispensationalists conclude this entire discourse isn't about the church at all. It's the job of the rest of the New Testament describing this mystery form of the kingdom we're experiencing right now until Messiah returns. Jesus is returning, and he will establish that kingdom and he will fulfill all those Old Testament promises and prophecies. The hardening of the heart and the blinding of the eyes, Paul tells us about in Romans, will be removed from the Jews, and they will recognize Jesus as their Messiah and King, and he will place in them a new heart. But what will God have to do to get their attention? Well, I believe that that is the purpose of that great tribulation period, the time of Jacob's trouble Jesus talked about. Now, some people have a problem with the idea of Jews re-implementing the sacrificial system in a rebuilt temple. But the pieces are obviously coming together, and the times of the Gentiles are coming to a close. If current events are any indication, there really isn't much time left.
Every day, 3 times a day, Jews recite this prayer: "May it be your will that the temple be speedily rebuilt in our own time." It's a prayer they prayed for almost 2,000 years.
But Jews here in Jerusalem are doing more than just praying. Just a few steps away from the Western Wall, rabbis and craftsmen are building what they call a temple in waiting.
We're supposed to build a temple, and nothing about that changed. Nothing about that commandment changed.
Chaim Richman is a director at the Temple Institute in Jerusalem.
The Temple Institute is actively engaged in research and preparation for the resumption of the service in the Holy Temple, to the extent of actually preparing operational blueprints for the construction of the temple according to the most modern standards.
This menorah is just one of several vessels created for the next temple. It's covered with 95 pounds of pure gold and has a price tag of $2 million.
Piece by piece, the third temple is taking shape, with priest garments, vessels of copper, gold, and silver, and a new generation of Levite priests, specially trained for temple service.
We have enough in place now to resume the divine service and to build the temple. But obviously, a lot of things have to happen in order for this to happen.
Richmond isn't the only one who's ready to rebuild.
You actually have blueprints, architectural drawings for the third temple?
3,000 years after King Solomon built the first Jewish temple, another Solomon is laying the foundations for the third.
From the womb of my mother, I have a task and a mission in my life, which is connected with the rebirth of Israel.
Gershon Solomon leads a group called the Temple Mount Faithful. They commissioned these cornerstones for the third temple. The 6-ton stones were consecrated with water from the biblical pool of Siloam and cut with diamonds.
And why God commanded us not to cut them by iron? Don't forget that these are stones for the house of God. They cannot be like other stones.
For several years, Solomon and his followers tried to place the stones on the Temple Mount, and every year they were stopped by Israeli police.
Unfortunately, weakness of the Israeli leadership did not allow us to bring the cornerstone to the right place. The end-time temple should be built on the same location of the first and the second temple.
But that location is already occupied. The holiest site for Jews is also the third holiest site for Muslims. And neither side is ready to share.
The Temple Mount, 35 acres of it, is the most explosive piece of territory on the face of the planet.
In 2002, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat told an Arab newspaper that the Israelis found not a single stone proving that the Temple of Solomon was there, because the temple was not in Palestine at all.
The issue of the temple, it's so sensitive.
Dr. Yusuf Nache is in charge of tourism at the Dome of the Rock. Here's what he had to say when I asked him about the Jewish temple.
It's not an undeniable fact. It is theories, and the political situation, the misunderstanding, the mistrust distorted all the facts.
That is stupid, because the Arabs themselves, they call Jerusalem the place of the temple. And the golden dome right behind me, the Dome of the Rock, was built in order to replace Solomon's temple. I think this temple denial is more serious than the Holocaust denial.
To counter this so-called temple denial, Gabriel Barkay is pushing the archaeological envelope. Muslim law forbids any digging on the mount itself. So instead, Barkay's digging through its trash.
We have here the entire history of the Temple Mount.
He and his team are sifting through truckloads of debris, unearthed by bulldozers and discarded by Muslim authorities.
So there could be artifacts in here going back to the first and second temple? And
yes, there are, no doubt.
Among their finds, a Babylonian arrowhead from the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC, and this 2,400-year-old Hebrew coin, the oldest ever minted in Jerusalem.
Do you think in your lifetime there'll ever be a time when you can actually investigate what's under the Temple Mount?
No, I don't. I'm very pessimistic about it.
Some of the most dramatic traces of temple life have been unearthed here at the Western Wall.
This street was part of the marketplace outside the Second Temple. On the walls, you can still see the marks from the fires that destroyed the temple in 70 AD, and overturned stones still lying where they were thrown from the top of the Temple Mount by the armies of Rome.
On one stone is a Hebrew inscription, "To the place of trumpeting." It's a set of ancient directions to the southwest corner of the temple, where trumpeters announced the arrival of the Sabbath 2,000 years ago. Even more intriguing is the part of the Western Wall that's still underground.
Amongst the courses of the Western Wall, I mean the line of stones which we have here, this is the greatest and the most exciting one we have here.
Dan Bahat spent 40 years excavating the tunnels around the Temple Mount, and he says the most compelling case for the temple is yet to be discovered.
I believe that behind this stone is a large arch which forms a storehouse, a big storehouse, which stored all the treasures of the temple. But we don't have till now anywhere where those treasures were, and the only possibility is that it must be subterranean somewhere around the Temple Mount. I believe that it might have been behind this wall.
So do you think it's possible that the treasures are still there?
I hope so. Maybe in the future, when it will be possible to dig, maybe we'll get to there. I say we, it must be my grandchildren, the earliest.
But Bahat's interest in the temple is strictly in its past, not in its future.
There is no chance whatsoever for the third temple. The third temple will be when the Messiah comes, and both of our Jews and Christians are waiting for him. So let us see when he comes what happens. It won't happen before.
Rabbis for centuries did not understand this and in fact argued, well, are we supposed to build the temple and then the Messiah will come? Or are we supposed to wait and then the Messiah will build the temple?
Again, I could hear the voice of God like he's speaking to all of us. I brought you here to build my house. Build my house.
Today is really a historical event for the Jewish people. It is the beginning of the work of the Third Temple, construction for the Third Temple. Here in Mitzpeh Yericho, we are building a field school for Kohanim and Levites in order to teach them the work that they have to do in Yerushalayim when the temple will be rebuilt.
We are starting to build the replica of the temple here in Mitzpeh Yericho that will serve as a school to educate the Kohanim, the priests, how to serve in the temple. It will be an exact replica of the temple, and today we're drilling the holes for the libations, the water and wine libations in the altar.
And they will learn exactly what they have to do When the time comes and the temple is rebuilt in Jerusalem, they will know exactly how to perform this service.
In the time when the Arabs are writing in Yerushalayim, and the spokesman is saying that the temple wasn't built in the Temple Mount. Never the Jews had the Bet HaMikdash there. If they would have there, they would never let the Arabs go up there. And this time that the Arabs are trying to throw us out of Har HaBayit, out of the Temple Mount, saying you don't have anything to do, we have to strengthen our connection in trying to show that we have what to say. We're going to teach the Kohanim how to work in Bet HaMikdash. And with God's help, faster than we have the students, we will have the people going to work and sacrifice korbanot in Bet HaMikdash.
During the Sukkot holiday, of course, the priests would do a water libation for the purpose of bringing blessing to the water that we so desperately need, especially now that there's been a drought for several years. And the water would drip down through what we call the shitin, these holes underneath the altar, down into the bedrock, and would bring a blessing to the waters of the world. So this is what's happening today, is that we're digging these holes in the ground as the beginning, as the first step in building this replica of the temple.
We've been waiting for the last 2,000 years for the rebuilding of the third temple. And here it is, for the first time, we're actually taking concrete measures in order to fulfill that dream and start the process of the third temple.